Remember how I said that civil law tends to be underpinned by the moral law? Well, we might be able to picture it something like this. Because I live in Great Britain, I am subject to the civil laws of Great Britain, and those British civil laws have historically been underpinned by the moral law. So for example, the moral law says that theft is wrong, so the British law that sits on top of it says that theft is illegal in this country. The moral law says that murder is wrong, so the British law that is built on top of it says that murder is illegal in this country. Now what if Great Britain as a political entity suddenly ceased to exist? That would mean that British civil law has suddenly ceased to exist too. So if you stole or murdered, you would no longer be breaking British law because there would be no such thing as Great Britain. The police officers and the judges couldn't enforce the law and put you in jail because there would no longer be a British law to enforce at all. But would that suddenly make it morally okay to steal and murder in this country? Of course not. It would still be immoral because the moral law that underpins it would still remain. In fact, the moral law will always remain. Murder was morally wrong before the British government existed, and it will still be wrong even if the British government stops existing. Murder is wrong whether the government says it's wrong or not. Murder is wrong whether there's anybody to enforce it or not. Murder is wrong because the moral law says that it's wrong, and the moral law is eternal, constant, and unchanging. It's an expression of the God who is eternal, constant, and unchanging. The moral law has no beginning and no end because God has no beginning and no end. We will always be answerable to Him. In other words, civil laws come and go and are variable over time, but the moral law is not. Now, when God established the nation of Israel in the Old Testament through Moses, they too needed a civil law to govern their land. And this civil law was also to be underpinned by God's eternal moral law. Let's rewind back a bit here. Back in the book of Genesis, God had promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation and that they would inherit a piece of land that they could call their own. This nation was going to be called Israel. However, God's promise was not brought to fruition straight away. Through various twists and turns of events over many generations, Abraham's descendants found themselves in slavery in Egypt. And it was while they were in slavery in Egypt that God raised up Moses to release them from that bondage so that they could inherit the land flowing with milk and honey at last, the one that had been promised to Abraham all those years before. It was in that land that they were to form their brand new nation. Most people know the story of how Moses confronted Pharaoh and how God sent plagues upon the land to force him to release his people. But perhaps what's less well known is that after leaving Egypt, they didn't reach their new piece of real estate straight away. In fact, they ended up wandering in the Sinai desert for 40 years. The period in the wilderness before they inherited the promised land was an important time of preparation for the people. And it was during this time that God gave Moses the civil laws that were to govern them in their brand new nation. Every nation needs a written constitution or a legal framework, and this would be theirs. Moses wrote the laws down, and therefore it has become known as the Law of Moses, or the Mosaic Law. The most well-known section of the Mosaic Law is, of course, the Ten Commandments, which were written in tablets of stone by God's own hand at the top of Mount Sinai. Pretty much everyone knows about them, even if just through the Cecil B. DeMille movie starring Charlton Heston, and they help to form the moral core of the Mosaic Law. But the whole law was actually far more extensive than just 10 commandments. There were actually 613 individual rules altogether. 365 of them were negative commands, that is, you shalt nots, and 248 of them were positive commands, that is, you shalt. The 613 laws could broadly be divided into three categories. There were moral laws, for example, don't murder, don't lie, and don't steal, etc. There were ceremonial laws, that is, instructions on religious observance, worship, structure of the priesthood, sacrifices, etc. And then there were social laws, that is, how to run society, how to run the economy, how to resolve disputes and care for the land, and things like that. In other words, this law was to govern every single aspect of life in Israel, a bit like the British civil law does here, or like the Swedish law does in Sweden, or like the Canadian law does in Canada. And just as the British civil law doesn't apply in Japan or Norway or Mexico or Ghana or anywhere else, the law of Moses did not apply anywhere else either. It was for the people of Israel only and their brand new country. What God had established here was a theocracy. He was king of this nation. At this early stage, they had no human king. And as head of state, God was giving them a written law to live by in their new country, just like a human king would have done. This law was signed off with a covenant from God, which basically said that if they followed the law well, they would experience a threefold blessing of prosperity, health, and safety. However, if they disobeyed the law, they would experience a threefold curse of poverty, sickness, and terror. For as long as the law of Moses was in effect, these promises would apply, and you can read about the promises of the covenant by opening up the Bible at Deuteronomy 28. You can also read about the laws themselves in the book of Leviticus. The law of Moses governed Israel's moral, religious, and civil life for the rest of the Old Testament period, right up until the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when you read about the law in the Bible, or hear a Christian talking about the law, this is almost always what's being referred to, the law of Moses.